All right, let us continue. Hopefully this one doesn't get lost in the mysterious void of the internet. Lecture 18, the Opiate of the Masses. Previously, we have been talking about how medieval Christianity was a wacky, weird place, full of magic Jesus wizards, fetishization of corpses as sites for the holy, highly strung monks and nuns, all interwoven with a fear and fascination with human sexuality, and, of course, the vaginal Jesus. This week, I want to talk about why that medieval piety has been sanitized in modern memory. Why we see these movies like Kingdom of Heaven, which just have, craven archbishops who all are willing to give up religion in a second or manipulate people. What's the other one with that one? We haven't watched, but Pillars of the Earth, if you've seen it, has a very similar turn by Ian McShane. Evil inquisitors, Spanish Inquisition, Torquemunda, that sort of a thing. Jaded atheists, again, Kingdom of Heaven is a great example of that sort of a deal. That is, we've spent a lot of time thinking through nationalism about how the Middle Ages are a privileged origin, but relatively little time thinking about why the Middle Ages are also a condemned past. That dichotomy we set up earlier in the year. And, I don't want to oversell medieval religion. I mean, yes, of course, I'm interested in it because of who I am and what I study, but some of it is boring, okay? I've shown you the interesting parts. I've made a particular sales pitch here. Scholastic theology, people talking about, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, how specifically Christ manifests in the Eucharist, that sort of a thing is super dry and dull. So many of the monks we encounter are absolutely devout and pious and not running around and having sex with everything they can find. But, on the whole, we have something that was much more interesting than we now remember it to be. Much more diverse, much more organic in a sense. Because now we think about the Middle Ages as a period where the church was in strict control over everything. They dominated Europe. They refused to let any sort of interesting things happen. And they kept everyone stupid, which is where we get the phrase, the opiate of the masses, comes from Karl Marx. Religion is the opiate of the masses. The thing that keeps the masses in their drugs so that they don't rise up and that they don't cause any trouble for the elites. A very functionalist view of Christianity and of religion in general. So why do we think of the Middle Ages as the ultimate manifestation of that kind of manipulative religiosity? Well, there's three reasons. There's the way in which Protestants try to remember the Catholic Church. There are discourses of secularism and state power that follow from the scientific enlightenment of the 17th and 18th century, which created science as a distinct and privileged branch of knowledge production, as opposed to a more equal system which existed before. And finally, there's the way the Catholic Church remembers itself. And we're going to touch on the first two this week, this lecture, and the last one is going to be the next lecture. Because 1 and 2, or the all three of them are, of course, interrelated. And specifically, Catholic memory is in many ways a response to Protestant memory, at least initially. And to figure out why that is, we need to go back a bit. If you feel, by the way, that I've been telling the same story multiple times through from slightly different perspectives, that's something I am doing on purpose. So back to 1500 circa. By 1500, most people thought the Catholic Church was deeply corrupt and money hungry. The Renaissance papacy, the popes from the 14th and 15th centuries, were more like secular princes than good bishops. They built huge palaces, and they waged warfare. Perhaps the best example, worst example, whichever way you want to go with that, of this later papacy was Rodrigo Borgia, who is reigned as Pope Alexander VI, and had a very, very bad but good pseudo-documentary made about him, featuring Jeremy Irons, and who would not want to be portrayed by Jeremy Irons in a historical drama. Rodrigo was of Valencian nobility. That means he comes from the east coast of Mediterranean Spain, the area around Valencia, where the almonds come from. He was a power player, Mr. Borgia, inside the Vatican for 40 years. He studied law originally at Bologna, which, if you remember, is the preeminent medieval university for the study of law, and was apparently quite good at it. He was made a cardinal deacon. There are 3 ranks of cardinal: cardinal deacon, cardinal priest, cardinal bishop. Depends on what your position is in the church. Doesn't super matter. He was made a cardinal deacon and chancellor of the papal court, which is a much more important thing. There are more cardinals than there are chancellors of the papal court, at the age of 25. And if you remember from last lecture, you cannot be ordained as a priest, let alone a cardinal, until you are 35 by canon law. And he was made the chancellor of the papal court and deacon and archbishop of Valencia for good measure under his uncle, Pope Calixtus III. And of course, this career shows many of the problems that existed in the Roman Curia. The age requirement thrown out the window. Technically, you're not allowed to hold multiple church offices, right? You can't be both the cardinal deacon of a church in Rome, which is where the cardinals are located, and Archbishop of Valencia. You can't do both of those things because you can't be in Valencia and Rome at the same time, of course. You have to find someone else to fill in your bishoply duties in Valencia, which is something called absenteeism. So you would have people who are absent from their sees, and they find someone else and they pay them to do their jobs, which they usually didn't do very well, and therefore you had a general decline in religious education. So he is an absentee bishop. So Borgia, when he is eventually elected pope, right, sort of stands in for the worst of the Renaissance papacy. He also probably bribed his way into the election. There's stories of him delivering Cardinal Sforza, who is one of his 2 main rivals for the papacy, a mule load of silver for his allegiance. And as with every single other person who has bribed his way into office, after doing so, he had to borrow money to do so, because it's very expensive. He's bribing people who are being bankrolled by the kings of France and Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor. To compete with them, he has to borrow. And now he has debts he needs to pay back, which means he wants to use the church's massive tax apparatus to bring money to him. This is in no way, shape, or form unusual. Rodrigo Borgia, we'll see in a second. Anyway, his son, Cesare Borgia, replaces, yes, he has a son. He's been a priest for 40 years. He still has a son. Get to that. Replaces him as Archbishop of Valencia when he is 17 and is made a cardinal at 18, again, disregarding any sort of canonical age requirements. To reinforce the fact, this is the son of a pope. There were a lot of quote-unquote nephews at the papal court. Half of the College of Cardinals were papal nephews. What that means, the word nepotes in Latin, from which we get nepotism, is actually vague as to what the actual relationship is, and it just means family member. So probably could be their nephews, could also be their son from a prostitute or concubine. Now, as I said, this is all in no way unusual for the papacy, really for the 14th and 15th centuries. Alexander VI has a bad rap, mostly because of the Spanish and French, the rivalry between Spain, from which he comes, and France in this period. And also because of his attempts to cohere the Papal States, that is, the territories in central Italy, theoretically subservient directly to the Pope, against French invasion. Also, Giuliano della Rovere, who succeeded Alexander VI, was Alexander's deepest enemy. He was the one who lost the last papal election in which Alexander got elected. He was outbribed. And then as Julius II, when he was elected after Alexander's death, and the very rapid death of... so Alexander dies, theoretically of poisoning, it's unclear, in 1503. His successor is elected, is an older guy who manages to die within a month. And then, again, suspicious circumstances. And then Julian de la Rovere is elected as Pope Julius II. And Julius II spends a lot of time making sure Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, is poorly remembered. Of course, Julius II is not great either. The famous Erasmus of Rotterdam, if you have ever heard that name, wrote a little pamphlet titled Julius Exclusus, which means Julius locked out. And where is he locked out of? Well, heaven, of course. It's all a dialogue of Julius II pleading with St. Peter to please let him into heaven, and St. Peter being absolutely not. Anyway, Alexander's son Cesare, as I mentioned before, is the one to whom Machiavelli addressed, or the case study that Machiavelli used in his famous book, The Prince, which it's unclear, actually, if this is supposed to be these days, people have started to read The Prince, which is a book which is all about how to manipulate political opponents and hold on to power. Whether or not this is a book which is intended to advise or intended to mock. In any way, case, Cesare resigned, who's here back in the left. That's his sister, who he seems to be embracing, by the way. Just whatever. Cesare is deeply involved in consolidating papal power in the Papal States under his father, as the general of the papal armies, the generalissimo of the papal armies, and then later as just sort of a renegade who is being pursued by Julius II. He's generalissimo of the papal armies. I mentioned he was a cardinal. He's actually the very first person to resign a cardinalcy in history. He decides to unpriest himself and become generalissimo of the papal armies. He is, in the end, betrayed and dies, and then made into a Assassin's Creed video game. This is, of course, not a terribly pious story, even if we consider the manipulations of later memories. But what the story of the Borgia Pope tells us is that Borgia, the original crime family, sorry, I just remembered that subtitle. What the story of the Borgia Pope tells us is that there was an intense papal need for money to buy offices, to wage war, and to make art and build palaces. And consequently, there was massive discontent with this, with the papacy as an institution across Europe. As I said before, it gained power at the expense of its credibility over much of the later Middle Ages. In this period, around the Borgias, there were calls for reforming councils, as there had been when the papacy was in schism, when, remember, it was divided between Rome and Avignon. There was 2 popes, and then there was 3 popes, and then there were 4 popes. The resolution to that was through the calling of church councils. Of course, once the single pope was put back, Martin V, once all his opponents were deposed and Martin V was made the single pope again in Rome, he nixed councils and stopped any from forming again. This is also, by the way, if you are ever interested in his Dark Materials fiction series, Philip Pullman, this is probably the failure of conciliarism of church councils in the 15th century to effect meaningful change in the church is where his history breaks from ours. Just as that's the point of departure in that timeline. But there are the popes from, Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI, Julian II, none of them allow church councils to be called, and so there's no real mechanism for reforming the church, and discontent is growing. And so, about 14 years after the death of Alexander VI, on October 31st, All Hallows Eve, Halloween, 1517, Martin Luther, this guy here, a professor of theology at Württemberg, the University of Württemberg in Germany, nails 95 theses to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral. That is to say, he nails to the door of the cathedral 95 topics for debate regarding current church doctrine. This is a common method in this period of time of announcing a topic for public debate. This is not a revolutionary act. It sounds like these days, he went to the state house and nailed things to the door. That sounds like, an assault almost on the building. This was pretty typical. The front door of a cathedral will be covered in flyers of various sorts and claims and proclamations and that sort of a thing. It's a place to read. Think of it as a public bulletin board. Anyway, he nailed these 95 theses to the door, and it's calling for a debate. And of course, they were in Latin. So the only people who could understand them were those who were themselves well educated. The content of these theses was fairly straightforward. 2 major themes. 1, he challenged the papal ability to remit sin and punishment, particularly with with respect to purgatory. And that tied into his second theme, which is to attack the practice of selling indulgences. That is to say, remember these documents, they said, if you pay 1 piece of gold, you will get 40,000 years of your time in purgatory remitted. And he says, this practice is terrible, and also the Pope doesn't have the power to do that, even if it was a good practice. And he actually gives the Pope an out here. He does what actually a lot of people in Reform era type things to do. He says, the Pope is getting bad advice and he doesn't know the things that are being done in his name. And if only he was to learn about this through me, Martin Luther, he would come down and reform things, right? It's a way for the Pope to act with saving face. The Pope does not take kindly to this, regardless of Martin's little attempt at being politic here. Because this is a direct attack on papal finances. Popes made a lot of money off of selling indulgences. And they needed a lot of money, right? They needed to wage war in Italy to defend themselves against the French kings, to build their lovely palaces, and to pay off the debts that they had accrued by being elected pope. Luther is almost immediately summoned to Rome in 1518, so shortly in January of the next year, I think. He does not go because he's not an idiot. He has seen, as I mentioned before, what happened to Jan Hus and to he does not want to put himself into the direct control of the papacy for good reasons. But this, of course, is now disobedience to papal authority, in the same way that the Waldensians had disobeyed papal authority, right? And disobedience is quite simply a heresy, right? To be disobedient to the Pope is definitionally to make oneself a heretic in later medieval Christianity. Eventually, the breaks become wider. Luther decides to kind of go down a rule, this sola scriptura, this text alone route that Wycliffe had pioneered, that we have discussed in previous lectures, and eventually decides that the papacy can no longer be reformed, and a clean break and restart is needed. And so we have the Reformations, Protestant Reformation. And the particular reasons for Luther's success and the Protestant success in kind of breaking from the Catholic Church, where Hus and others who we have discussed, Hus and the Waldensians and the Lollards, had been simply repressed, are complex. And the study of, and to learn about them, I suggest you take a course on the Protestant Reformations. For our purposes here, we need to note that the Reformation saw itself, as an assault on papal excess, papal corruption, and the worldliness of the church. That is, it sought to reform the contemporary church into the original form of Christianity. And this took a lot of different forms, this attempt to reform. The most obvious is an interest in the Greek and Hebrew text of the Bible, the real text of the Bible, the original languages in which the Bible was written. And this was in some ways revolutionary, because the Latin that Jerome had translated the Greek and Hebrew into in the 4th and 5th century, 1,000 years before, was not always faithful. It was Jerome's translation. Translation is an act of interpretation. And so one famous statement upon reading the Greek Bible, one theologian is said to have said, this is not the Bible, or we are not Christians. The Reformation, and I want to draw that period there, because this language immediately associates the Latin Bible and Catholicism with superstition, and a-Christianity with false Christianity, and the Protestant Bible based on Greek and Hebrew language, the original languages, as real, as the proper original scientific study of religion. The Protestant Reformation also almost immediately dissolves into warfare and violence across all of Western Europe, which continues for at least 200 years. This foments deep, bitter, lasting divisions between Catholics and Protestants across Europe, divisions which exist to this very day. As an aside, something that doesn't quite fit into this, but I want to kind of note here, the persecution of women, this period, the 16th and 17th centuries, are also a period of very rapid increasing persecution of women. Catholic reforms in the 15th century had locked down a lot of female piety. A lot of these kind of crazy women doing their prophetess things, Catherine of Siena, things like that, had been shoved into monasteries, essentially, to be quiet behind those walls. The ones who continued outside were burned as witches. And this is where we start having witch trials and things like that. But of course, witch trials were equally, for the Protestants and the Catholics were both more than happy to burn people as witches. But it is remembered as a Catholic thing, which is something to note. And through this, and because of sort of the warfare and violence, it doesn't really make sense to see the Reformation as the Reformation remembers itself, which is to say, a rejection of tyrannical authority, right? Of false papal imposition of papal authority on people who should be free from it. It's just the imposition of a different form of tyrannical authority. And this is actually really clear in Martin Luther himself, right? Because Martin Luther says, sola scriptura, the scripture alone dictates what we should do as Christians. And this means we should not have papal authority over what we should do as Christians. And German peasants in what is now Germany, were like, sure, that sounds cool. Also, that probably means we shouldn't have landlords, right? And so they rose up in rebellion in what is called the German Peasants' War in 1524. Right? The peasants say that Luther's opposition to the church was a call or a parallel to revolt against the aristocracy. Luther angrily rejects this peasant revolt, not in a little bit because the people who are keeping him safe from the papacy are the aristocracy. And of course says, of course, you peasants can't interpret the scripture. Only smart people can. And 200,000 peasants are massacred. So, and again, as from this we see, it's just, Luther just doesn't want this authority that he disagrees with. He still thinks that sort of totalitarianism is necessary and a good thing. And so from the beginning, this idea of the Protestant Reformation as a freedom movement is just simply ridiculous and nonsense, but it is still there in the mind. And as I said, the Catholic Church tries to put down these rebellious reformers in their language, at least initially. And it does not succeed, just as it didn't with the Waldensians, right? The Waldensians just split off and did their own thing. And just as with the Dominicans and Franciscans, who were orders created to rectify the mistake of throwing the Waldensians out in a lot of ways, the church realizes eventually that some reforms are important. And so you have what is called the Council of Trent in 1555, which launches what historians will call the Counter-Reformation. And this Counter-Reformation actually addresses a lot of the Protestant concerns with the Catholic Church. It does not remove practices of indulgence. It does not make the church make the papacy less illustrious and wealthy, but it does see a systemization and structuring of theology under the specific theology of Thomas Aquinas, who at this point in time who is a 13th century philosopher, theologian, who had been very popular in the Dominican order, but not in the broader church until this point in time. From this point in time on, from Trent onwards, Aquinian theology is the default theology of the Catholic Church. There are some anti-corruption measures, and they re-edit the Latin Bible with Greek and Hebrew in mind. They go back to the Greek and Hebrew texts and make some changes to Jerome's translation. And so we no longer have the Jeromine Vulgate, but the Clementine Latin Vulgate under Pope Clement, who commissioned this sort of a thing. This is too little, too late. And just like the effects of fake news, which we see in modern society, the early claims made by the Protestants set the terms for future debates. That is, Catholics have to react against the accusations that they are deluded, superstitious, manipulative, that Catholicism is not true belief. Right? They are not allowed to, they have to say, no, we're not. They have to grant the question can be asked in the first place. And that's going to be, most of this is going to be the Catholic self-imagination in response to this is going to be next lecture, so we'll talk about that then. But also, the Inquisition was a pretty terrible tool of repression. Even if the Papal Inquisition, which had been ongoing since the Cathars in the 13th century, is not the same as the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition, which was a uniquely terrible version of that Inquisition that occurred in Spain. There's two different things. The Papal Inquisition still exists, actually. It's called the Committee for the Protection of the Doctrine of the Faith. The last most powerful head of the Committee for the Protection of the Doctrine of the Faith was a Cardinal Ratzinger, who ruled as Pope Benedict I can't remember which number he was. Benedict several. The one who preceded the current Pope, and who is still who retired and is still living in the Vatican. The interest in Greek Catholicism also maintained itself as a single entity in this period, right? As opposed to Protestantism, which fragmented quite quickly. Because, of course, if Scripture alone will tell you what is true, a lot of the people are going to have a lot of different versions of Scripture, and they're all going to fight. So Catholic faith maintained its sort of homogeneity, and Protestantism fragmented in this period. Anyway, interest in Greek and Hebrew among Protestant biblical study, particularly, resonated deeply with what's called Renaissance humanism and naturalism. Interest in collecting bits of nature, understanding nature, looking back to Greek and Roman texts as sources of great inspiration, of which Boccaccio's Decameron features quite prominently as an early Renaissance humanist text. Also in this period, we see the printing press and distribution of knowledge. The printing press come into being, the distribution of knowledge increases. A printed book, even within 50 years of the invention of the printing press, a printed book would cost about a day's wage for a laborer, so very cheap. Of course, binding that book would be 3 times more expensive than the book itself, but the unbound pages would be about a day's labor worth of work. So you could now buy a book versus something that had to be written out by hand, which would cost you more than a year's labor. Which is kind of funny, actually, that the printing press is so quickly associated with Protestantism, because, of course, the pamphlets printed by the printing press did allow the rapid distribution of Protestant ideas. But England, which is itself Protestant from, let's say 1540, had one of the most strict, and France, which is half Protestant, which had a pretty big war between Protestants and Catholics, both had very, very, very strict control over printing presses, right? They were not into the dissemination of information because, of course, as with England, as with Martin Luther, rejection of papal authority meant adherence to the local authority, in this case, the King of England, Henry VIII. And there are several also in this period. This is a period with several high-profile incidents, Galileo among them, which lead to easy retrospective claims that Catholics were anti-science, right? The imprisonment of Galileo for espousing heliocentrism. The sun is the center of the earth, the center of the universe, the center of the solar system, at least, for them, the universe, is reinforced. It plays very well into a dichotomy between Catholic superstition and Protestant scientific enlightenment, progressivism, and science. And of course, the development of science and the secularization of the processes in the 18th century look back to things like Galileo being imprisoned for heresy, for saying that the sun was the center of the solar system, as a moment of medieval Catholic repression. But it's worth noting that recent scholarship kind of looking at Galileo and the Galileo's failure in his to be the Galileo's court presence suggests that Galileo's imprisonment for heresy is actually a failure of court intrigue, that he was not good enough of a courtier to the papal curia to get what he wanted through, rather than sort of a inherent disbelief in religion, or inherent religious disbelief in science. The popes at the time were being quite interested in Renaissance science. They were part of this Renaissance humanist atmosphere, as we have discussed. Because, of course, science, that is to say, natural philosophy, before 1700, looks very, very, very different than it does after, and then as we think of it today. Before, let's call it roughly 1700, during the age of exploration, as it were, when Europeans are, discovering various bits of the globe or introducing smallpox to various bits of the globe, science, what we would now think of as kind of scientific endeavor, was really obsessed with basically collecting flora and fauna from various different places and putting it in your house and showing it to all your friends so that they can see how rich and well educated you are. Travel the world, kill the people you meet, and bring back plants was basically the European modus operandi in the 17th century. That is to say, major early quote-unquote scientific collections come from court culture. They're in Italy, France, England, and Spain, collecting natural items from the New World, collecting these items of supposedly scientific value, of natural philosophical value, is not very different than collecting art. In fact, almost no different than collecting art. But over the 17th century, there is a slow transition from the German word is Wetten, or actually the Dutch word is Wetten, which is like wisdom or knowledge from discourse, information that you can obtain through thinking about things, to Kennen, which is knowledge in a proper form, that is knowledge from objects. And if you ever want to learn more about that transition, I highly advise you take a class with Hal Cook here in the history department. And this transition from wisdom to knowledge, as it were, is true in both Protestant and Catholic spheres. And if knowledge, in 1600, if knowledge is from discourse and thinking, if it's wisdom, there's no fundamental difference between philosophy, history, or what we would now call science. Such distinctions come later and are written backwards. For example, in the 17th century, in the late 17th century, there's a debate between Robert Boyle and Thomas Hobbes. Those of you who have taken science courses or history courses or political science courses should recognize these names. Robert Boyle is the Boyle of Boyle's law, that is pressure 1 volume 1 equals pressure 2 volume 2. That is the ratio of pressure and volume will change based on the size of the container, but in a linear relationship. Thomas Hobbes, well known for his book The Leviathan, which is a work of political philosophy. And in this case, these guys are having a debate over what would become Boyle's law. And in this we can see that both someone who we would now consider a political philosopher and someone we would now consider a scientist were considered able to interact and discuss things with each other in this period of time. Boyle, really Boyle's assistant Hooke, who also has a law named after him, but Boyle deduced a natural law, P1V1 equals P2V2, from an apparatus. That is the thing behind me, the vacuum pump. A pump that creates a full vacuum. Hobbes does not like this. He is disturbed by the idea of truth being generated from a machine rather than abstract principle. He does not like knowledge that comes from something other than wisdom. Right? Because a different machine could give you a different law, theoretically. How can you tell that the cylinder in the center has a vacuum absent the apparatus itself? Right? The truth is valued in the machine. Truth exists in this machine, not in some sort of other place. Also, a vacuum pump in the 17th century is an incredibly expensive thing to produce. It means that only rich people can do science. Only rich people have access to the things that generate scientific truth. And isn't that a contradiction to the fundamental idea of science, that is to say, anyone can reproduce the results? And that's true today. Not everyone has access to a superconducting supercollider. And so we kind of have to take what the physicists who work on the superconducting supercollider say is true for fundamental particles and things like that on the basis of faith. Right? We cannot ourselves go out and reproduce their experiments. And so in a way, Hobbes' objections are quite important to consider still. Even though after kind of a back and forth for a while, Boyle did win out. As we now know, it's an uncontroversial idea that truth can reside in a machine. But it was not always thus. Right? And this is the transition from Wetten to canon, from wisdom to knowledge. Well, what does that have to do with medieval religion? It means that the Enlightenment, that 18th century, post-1700 science, starts to distinguish itself as a knowledge branch centered on observation and rational deduction from those observations. And with the kind of Protestant polemic of sola scriptura, that you have to look at the scripture, at the text, the empirical text, and use your knowledge on that piece of text to then make a conclusion, right? Empiricism becomes closely associated, scientific empiricism becomes more associated with Protestantism than Catholicism. This trend towards science being associated with Protestantism is reinforced by the fact that the Dutch and the English, two of the greatest naval forces and thus the greatest collectors of scientific objects, of natural objects, are themselves Protestant. And so by 1700, Protestantism constructs itself as anti-medieval religion. Observation, and so what is Protestant is therefore not medieval, right? So observation and rationality over unthinking belief, freedom over oppression, scripture over superstition. But also, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which we'll discuss in a bit, is an attempt to answer these Protestant objections, conceding, of course, the initial terms of the debate. That it has to deny, Catholicism, in order to respond to these Protestant claims, has to deny certain aspects of its medieval reality in order to seem more rational, freer, and scripture rather than superstitious. Scripture-based rather than superstitious. It wants to remember itself in a way which would be more acceptable to its contemporaries. And that we will get to in the next lecture. See you guys then.